The man who resurrected himself as Iron Man, who built a $300 million fortune from the ashes of addiction, hasn't been able to feel his left foot properly since 2021 due to peripheral neuropathy from decades of substance abuse finally collecting its bill. Robert Downey Jr., who became Hollywood's greatest comeback story, now takes 12 different medications daily just to maintain the appearance of the recovery everyone celebrates, while privately battling addiction transfer that shifted from heroin to control, from cocaine to compulsive perfection that his wife Susan calls sobriety that looks like sickness. Behind that charismatic smirk lies a man who can't remember entire years of his children's lives, who still apologizes to his eldest son Indio for genetic addiction he passed down like a curse, and who admits that playing Tony Stark wasn't acting, it was autobiography with better special effects. What you're about to discover will shatter the carefully crafted comeback narrative of Hollywood's most beloved recovering addict. If Robert Downey Jr.'s resurrection ever gave you hope, leave a like and subscribe below. There's a moment in Robert Downey Jr.'s childhood that explains everything. Being handed a joint by his father Robert Downey Sr. at age 6, the smoke filling his young lungs while his father laughed and called it bonding. Long before the world would know him as Iron Man, he was Bobby Downey, learning that love meant sharing daddy's substances, that attention required alteration, and that consciousness was something to escape rather than embrace. Robert was born on April 4, 1965, in Manhattan, to Elsie Ann, an actress who'd later disappear into her own addictions, and Robert Sr., an underground filmmaker whose idea of parenting was introducing his son to substances that would nearly kill him 40 years later. The Downey household was bohemian chaos disguised as artistic freedom. Robert Sr. was making experimental films funded by illegal activities, hosting parties where hard substances were served like appetizers, where 6-year-old Bobby would find his parents unconscious in positions that looked like death. Substances were like breakfast cereal in our house, Robert would later reflect in rehab. Available, encouraged, and the only reliable constant. His father believed chemicals expanded creativity, that getting high together was quality time, that teaching his son to prepare substances was a practical skill like tying shoes. By age 8, Robert was his father's regular companion in chemical exploration. They'd use before Robert's Little League games, take hallucinogens during camping trips that became vision quests a child couldn't process. When Robert had nightmares from the hallucinations, his father would give him downers to sleep. When he couldn't wake up for school, stimulants to counter the sedatives. I was a pharmaceutical experiment with a second-grade education, Robert explained decades later. My father was my dealer before I knew what dealers were. School became the place where Robert realized his family wasn't normal. Other kids talked about Disney movies. He'd seen his father's underground films featuring actual violence and adult content. Other fathers taught catch. His taught him to prepare substances properly so you didn't waste any. Teachers noticed Robert's erratic behavior, hyperactive some days, nearly comatose others. But in 1970s Greenwich Village, bohemian parents got passes regular people wouldn't. I learned to perform sobriety at 8, Robert admitted. Acting wasn't a career choice. It was survival. His mother Elsie's response was withdrawal. Not from substances, but from parenting. She'd disappear into her bedroom for days, emerging glassy-eyed and confused, asking Robert who he was before remembering. By the time his parents divorced when he was 13, Robert had tried every substance available in 1970s New York. The custody battle was really about who was less unfit. His father won by default because his mother had vanished completely into institutionalization. I didn't lose my mother to divorce, Robert reflected. I lost her to the same thing that would nearly take me, the inability to stop using once you start. Moving to California with his father at 14 was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it was graduation to harder substances, better quality, more access. Robert Sr. had connections in Hollywood who saw young Robert's talent and his weakness. By 15, Robert was the most naturally gifted and most chemically dependent student at Santa Monica High School. The boy who'd been taught that consciousness was optional would spend the next 30 years learning that eventually, the body keeps score. That childhood trauma doesn't disappear just because you become successful, and that the father who taught you to use would watch you nearly die from the lessons, unable to save you because he couldn't save himself. At 20, Robert Downey Jr. stood outside Saturday Night Live's offices in 1985, having just been hired as the youngest cast member ever at a salary that should have meant success, but instead funded a habit that cost more than he earned. He dropped out of Santa Monica High School at 17 to pursue acting, moving to New York with $300 and a connection to dealers his father had inadvertently provided. He was sleeping on friends' couches in the Lower East Side, working as a busboy at Central Falls Restaurant while auditioning during the day, using before auditions to take the edge off, but really adding edges that would cut him for decades. There was no plan B, he would later admit. But plan A required being high to function, so it wasn't really a plan. Those first years were exercises in performing functionality while falling apart. Robert's natural talent was undeniable. Casting directors called him brilliant but unreliable. Genius when he showed up. Magic if you could keep him focused. His SNL season was a disaster hidden in plain sight. He'd miss rehearsals, forget sketches mid-performance, ad-lib to cover blackouts from substances. Cast members Anthony Michael Hall and Joan Cusack tried interventions that Robert charmed his way out of. Lorne Michaels fired him after one season, later saying, "Robert had more talent than anyone, but talent without reliability is tragedy waiting to happen." The breakthrough from invisibility came through desperation and girlfriend Sarah Jessica Parker, who he'd met on the set of Firstborn. She saw his potential drowning in chemicals and tried to save him through love, a common mistake that would exhaust her over their 7-year relationship. She'd flush his substances, pay for rehab attempts, cover for his absences with elaborate lies. "Sarah gave me 7 years of her life trying to fix me," Robert later acknowledged. "But you can't love someone sober. They have to choose it." The real shift came through Less Than Zero in 1987, where Robert played a wealthy addict spiraling toward death, a role that required no acting, just Robert being himself on camera. The preparation was his actual life. The performance was documentary. Directors noticed he was brilliant when playing dissolution because he wasn't playing. Chaplin, in 1992, proved he could channel his chaos into character work, earning an Oscar nomination while high during most of filming. He'd shoot scenes perfectly on the first take, then disappear to his trailer for chemical maintenance, returning unable to remember what they'd filmed. But fate's cruelest gift was that Robert's addiction enhanced his early performances. The manic energy, the unpredictability, the danger beneath charm, all came from being constantly altered. Directors loved the edge he brought, not knowing it was actual edge, that he might explode or disappear at any moment. Between 1985 and 1996, he made 43 films, most forgotten, all funded by and funding his habit. He was Hollywood's most talented disaster, working constantly because working meant money for substances. Substances meant avoiding withdrawal, and withdrawal meant confronting who he was without chemicals, a person he hadn't met since age 6. The spiral accelerated with each success. More money meant more access. More access meant more consumption. More consumption meant needing more money. By 1996, Robert was earning $1 million per film, but spending $2 million on his habit, the math of addiction never balancing. He was 31, looked 41, and had the internal chemistry of someone who shouldn't still be alive. The role of Charlie Chaplin in Richard Attenborough's Chaplin wasn't supposed to resurrect Robert Downey Jr.'s career. He was the third choice after Robin Williams and Billy Crystal passed, cast partly because he was affordable at $750,000 while spiraling through addiction that made insurance companies nervous. Robert was 27, preparing to play a comedy legend while his own life was tragic farce, spending 4 months learning Chaplin's physicality while his body was betraying him through substance abuse. He'd watch Chaplin films on loop while high, studying movement through chemical haze, practicing walks and gestures between bathroom visits to maintain his habit. "I wasn't playing Chaplin," Robert later admitted. "I was recognizing a fellow addict who hid pain behind performance." Behind the scenes, Robert's preparation bordered on possession rather than performance. He lived as Chaplin off-camera, speaking in his accent, maintaining his posture, because staying in character meant avoiding himself. Director Richard Attenborough later revealed Robert would arrive either frighteningly focused or barely functional. No middle ground. There were two Roberts, the genius who channeled Chaplin perfectly, and the disaster we'd find passed out in his trailer. The famous scenes of Chaplin's physical comedy were achieved through Robert pushing his deteriorating body beyond limits, using substances to numb pain from injuries he wouldn't report. The physical transformation went beyond weight loss and movement. Robert studied how Chaplin used comedy to mask depression, how performance became armor against reality. The parallels were devastating. Both men had fathers who failed them. Both used their art to escape themselves. Both understood that making others laugh meant they wouldn't look too closely at your pain. During filming of Chaplin's later years, Robert didn't need makeup to look weathered. "I was 27 playing 60, he reflected, but my body was already there." When Chaplin released in December 1992, Robert's performance transcended his personal chaos. Critics who dismissed him as a talented waste suddenly recognized genius. Roger Ebert called it one of the greatest biographical performances ever filmed. The Academy Award nomination for Best Actor at 27 should have been triumph, but Robert was too high at the ceremony to fully comprehend what was happening. "I remember thinking the statue looked like it was melting," he later admitted. "That should have been my warning." But even at this pinnacle moment, darkness was winning. The Oscar nomination increased his quote to $2 million per film, which just meant more money for substances. Sarah Jessica Parker left him finally, exhausted from 7 years of trying to save someone who wouldn't save himself. The success of Chaplin convinced Robert he could manage his addiction, that it might even enhance his art. "The nomination validated my dysfunction," he explained in rehab. "If I could earn Oscar nominations while destroyed, why get clean?" The role that should have launched him to leading man status instead became evidence that talent could survive anything. But the cost was accumulating: missed opportunities, burned relationships, a reputation as brilliant but uninsurable. Casting directors would say, "Get me Robert Downey Jr., then add, "Actually, get me someone like him but reliable." The man who channeled Chaplin's pain so perfectly was about to discover that unlike movies, real life doesn't guarantee third acts, that sometimes the performance ends with the performer in handcuffs rather than holding awards. By 2008, Robert Downey Jr. wasn't just back. He was Hollywood's highest-paid actor at $75 million annually, having transformed from uninsurable liability to Iron Man, the role that launched the Marvel Cinematic Universe and earned $585 million worldwide. His resurrection from prison to superhero seemed like Hollywood's greatest comeback story. He owned properties worth $40 million, had been clean for 5 years, and married Susan Levin, the producer who'd saved his life with tough love rather than enabling. The man who'd been found unconscious in strangers' homes was now carrying billion-dollar franchises. But even at this impossible peak, Robert was white-knuckling sobriety through replacement addictions, exercise until injury, work until exhaustion, control until suffocation. The public saw triumph after triumph. Iron Man proving he could carry blockbusters. Tropic Thunder earning another Oscar nomination. Sherlock Holmes demonstrating range beyond Marvel. But privately, Robert was managing sobriety through obsessive routine that Susan called prison without bars. He'd wake at 4 a.m. for 2-hour workouts that left him depleted. He'd eat the same meals at exact times, any deviation triggering anxiety. Between takes, he'd do push-ups compulsively, counting to numbers that had mysterious significance. "I traded chemical addiction for behavioral addiction," he would later admit. Same disease, different symptoms. The relationship with Susan was genuine, but complicated by Robert's need for external structure. She wasn't just his wife. She was his unofficial probation officer, managing his schedule, monitoring his associations, maintaining the framework that kept him functional. Their prenuptial agreement included sobriety clauses that would forfeit everything if he relapsed. "Susan saved me by agreeing to be my warden," Robert explained. But wardens and prisoners don't have equal relationships. She controlled finances, vetted friends, and had veto power over roles that might trigger relapse. Working with directors like Jon Favreau and Guy Ritchie, Robert became known as the most professional actor on set. First to arrive, last to leave, memorizing everyone's lines not from dedication, but from fear that idle minds would remember how good substances felt. The Iron Man suit became metaphor and reality, armor that protected him from himself. During filming, he'd insist on wearing the practical suit even when CGI would be used, needing the weight, the restriction, the physical reminder of containment. "Success after addiction doesn't erase addiction," Robert told his sponsor during this period. "It just makes relapse more expensive." By 2010, at the absolute peak of his resurrection, Robert Downey Jr. had everything: critical acclaim, commercial dominance, a loving family with Susan and their son Exton. But he also had peripheral neuropathy developing in his extremities from decades of substance damage, chronic insomnia requiring medication that bordered on dependence, and the exhausting performance of recovery that never ended. The Tony Stark swagger wasn't acting, it was Robert's daily costume, the confidence everyone expected from someone who'd conquered addiction. But even at the height of everything, cracks showed to those who looked closely. The tremor in his hands during interviews he'd cover with gestures. The moments of confusion from sleep deprivation he'd charm through. The rigid control that made spontaneity impossible. Success had become another substance to abuse. The high of audience approval, the rush of box office records, the numbness of constant work preventing introspection. The man who'd nearly died from addiction had found sobriety, but he hadn't found peace. Robert's first marriage to Deborah Falconer in 1992 began with the desperate hope of two artistic souls who thought love could conquer addiction. She was a singer-actress who'd seen his genius beneath the chaos. He was riding high from his Oscar nomination for Chaplin, while secretly riding higher from substances that would destroy everything. They married after dating just 42 days, Robert proposing during a brief moment of clarity between binges. Their son Indio was born in 1993, and for exactly 3 weeks Robert stayed clean, holding his newborn while promising to be the father his own had never been. "I thought Indio would save me," Robert later admitted. "But you can't put that burden on a baby. They need you to save yourself first." The marriage became a hostage situation where addiction held everyone captive. Deborah would find Robert's hidden stashes, flush them, then watch him rage and disappear for days. She'd get calls from police stations, hospitals, dealers demanding payment. Indio's early memories were of Mom crying while Dad was sick again. Robert would miss birthdays while in rehab, holidays while in jail, first words and first steps while unconscious in places he couldn't remember. I was present for nothing but responsible for everything falling apart, he reflected with devastating honesty. The breaking point came in 1996 when Deborah found Robert teaching 4-year-old Indio to roll joints, repeating his father's pattern unconsciously. She grabbed their son and left, filing for divorce and sole custody. Robert's visitation rights required supervision, drug tests, and court appearances he'd missed because he was high. The divorce proceedings revealed the extent of destruction. Money disappeared, property sold for substances, and a husband who'd been physically present but emotionally absent since day one. Deborah gave me 6 years I didn't deserve, Robert acknowledged. She loved who I could be, not who I was. Then came Susan Levin in 2003, on the set of Gothica, where she was producing, and he was newly sober, fragile, and convinced he'd never have another relationship. Susan saw him differently, not as a project to fix, but as a person to support within strict boundaries. She made him wait 2 years before dating, requiring proof of sustained sobriety. Their first date came with conditions: no triggers, no bars, no situations where old patterns could resurface. Susan didn't save me, Robert explained. She agreed to walk beside me while I saved myself, but only if I did the work. Their marriage in 2005 was structured like a recovery program. Susan maintained control of finances, social situations, and career decisions because Robert needed external structure to maintain internal stability. She'd accompany him to sets, vet his associations, and had the nuclear option, leaving with their children if he relapsed. They had son Exton in 2012 and daughter Avery in 2014. But Robert's parenting was haunted by guilt over Indio, who'd inherited his father's addiction genetics and struggled with substances by age 20. Love in recovery is different, Robert told his sponsor. It requires admitting you're capable of destruction, that love alone won't keep you clean, that your partner deserves escape routes. The relationship with Susan worked because it acknowledged the monster in the room, addiction that was managed, not cured. But the cost was Robert never fully relaxing, never fully trusting himself, always performing stability even in his most intimate moments. The man who'd played romantic leads couldn't fully romance his own wife because vulnerability felt too close to relapse. In March 2021, during filming of Oppenheimer, Robert Downey Jr. collapsed in his trailer from what was initially diagnosed as exhaustion, but was actually peripheral neuropathy advancing to the point where he'd lost significant feeling in his left foot and partial sensation in both hands, the bill for decades of substance abuse finally coming due with compound interest. The immediate medical examination revealed nerve damage that doctors explained was irreversible, a progressive condition where the body's extremities slowly lose sensation, beginning with tingling and ending with complete numbness. My body kept score after all, Robert told Susan from the hospital. 20 years clean, but the damage was already done, just waiting to collect. The exact medical reality was more complex than simple nerve damage. Years of injected substances had created vascular problems that restricted blood flow. His liver, though functioning, showed scarring that affected its ability to process medications he now needed for the neuropathy. Blood tests revealed markers indicating his immune system was compromised, making him vulnerable to infections that normal people would easily fight. The decades of abuse, followed by years of extreme exercise as replacement addiction, had worn his body down to the point where, at 56, he had the internal wear of someone 70. The physical adaptations became elaborate choreography on film sets. Robert would need chairs between takes because standing for extended periods caused his legs to go completely numb. Fight scenes required multiple takes, not from complexity, but because he couldn't feel his feet properly, stumbling on marks he couldn't sense. The famous Tony Stark hand gestures became necessary to hide the tremor that worsened with fatigue. During Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan had to film around Robert's limitations, scheduling his scenes for mornings when symptoms were manageable. The treatment options were limited and depressing. Medications for neuropathy were often opioid-based, impossible for someone in recovery. Alternative treatments provided minimal relief. Physical therapy helped maintain function, but couldn't restore sensation. The daily routine became managing decline rather than seeking improvement. Morning exercises to maintain circulation, compression socks to prevent swelling, careful foot inspections for injuries he couldn't feel. "I check my feet like a diabetic," Robert explained to his doctor, "looking for damage I can't sense." Recovery from addiction suddenly seemed partial. Robert had been clean for 20 years but was still paying for the first 40. The neuropathy affected not just sensation but balance, coordination, and fine motor skills. He couldn't play piano anymore, couldn't feel texture properly, couldn't trust his body's feedback systems. Susan had to check his feet for cuts or bruises he didn't know were there. The Iron Man suit had been CGI, but the numbness was real and spreading. "The tragedy of recovery," Robert told his sponsor, "is that you get clean, but your body remembers everything. Every substance, every needle, every moment you chose numbness. It all gets tallied eventually." The diagnosis forced him to confront that sobriety hadn't erased damage, just stopped accumulation. His children watched their father struggle with stairs, need help with things requiring dexterity, age rapidly from conditions that were consequences of choices made before they were born. The man who'd played a superhero in armor was now trapped in a body that was slowly losing connection to itself, each day slightly number than the last. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on July 7, 2021, while Robert was in London filming Oppenheimer, his sister Allison's voice breaking as she told him their father Robert Downey Jr. had died at 85 from Parkinson's disease that had ravaged him for 5 years. The man who'd introduced Robert to substances at age 6, who'd been both his creator and destroyer, died in his sleep while Robert was an ocean away, playing another genius destroyed by his own creation. "He died while I was pretending to be Oppenheimer," Robert later reflected with bitter irony. "Both of us playing men who unleashed forces that consumed everything, including ourselves." The relationship between father and son had been Hollywood's most complicated recovery story. Robert Sr. had gotten clean in the 1990s, just as his son was spiraling toward prison. They'd essentially traded places, the father achieving sobriety while watching his son repeat every mistake with chemical precision. During Robert's worst years, his father would visit him in prison, in rehab, in court, seeing his own reflection criminalized. "Watching your son destroy himself with tools you gave him," Robert Sr. had said, "is the specific hell reserved for fathers who fail." The last 5 years of his father's life were cruel reversal. The Parkinson's that destroyed Robert Sr.'s body gave them time they'd never had, forced stillness where honesty lived. Robert would visit weekly when filming allowed, feeding his father meals he couldn't manage alone, having conversations that 40 years of substances had prevented. His father would apologize repeatedly for the childhood introduction to substances, his voice shaking from disease and regret. "I taught you to use before you knew how to refuse," he'd say through tears. What Robert never told anyone was that he'd been documenting his father's decline, filming their conversations for a documentary that became too painful to complete. The footage showed two men reconciling through shared addiction history, the father apologizing, the son forgiving, both knowing that forgiveness didn't erase consequences. In one recording, Robert Sr. admits, "I destroyed my son's childhood because I couldn't face my own sobriety. Every substance I gave him was one I couldn't refuse myself." The funeral was small, family only, held in Connecticut, where Robert Sr. had finally found peace. Robert delivered a eulogy that was equal parts love and rage, forgiveness and accusation. "My father gave me two gifts," he said, voice breaking. "He gave me creativity, and he gave me addiction. I kept both longer than I should have." The burial was surreal, burying the man who'd nearly buried him, mourning someone who'd been absent even when present, grieving a relationship that had been more chemical than emotional. The aftermath revealed how much Robert had been performing forgiveness rather than feeling it. Without his father to absolve or blame, he was left with just himself and the damage done. His own son, Indio, had struggled with substances, the genetic curse passing to a third generation, despite Robert's sobriety. "I broke the pattern, but not the genetics," Robert told Susan. "My father taught me to use. I taught my son by DNA. The curse just mutates." The loss wasn't just of his father, but of the possibility of ever fully understanding why a parent would choose to damage their child, why love and destruction lived in the same syringe, why the man who gave him life also gave him the means to end it. By 2019, Robert Downey Jr. sat atop a fortune worth $300 million, having earned $75 million for Avengers Endgame alone, making him Hollywood's highest-paid actor and the face of the most successful film franchise in history. But what the world didn't know was that Robert's exit from Marvel wasn't entirely voluntary. Insurance companies were becoming increasingly concerned about his neuropathy, requiring extensive medical examinations and raising premiums to levels that even Disney found challenging. The death of Tony Stark was convenient timing for a condition that made action sequences increasingly difficult. "I went from invaluable to uninsurable in 5 years," Robert told Susan. Same talent, failing body. The post-Marvel reality hit harder than expected. Without the MCU's guaranteed billions, Robert discovered Hollywood's short memory for actors approaching 60 with visible health issues. Doolittle, in 2020, lost $100 million, with critics noting Robert seemed disconnected and going through motions. They didn't know he couldn't feel his feet during many scenes. The film's failure wasn't just financial, but psychological, proving Robert couldn't open movies outside Tony Stark's shadow. Studios that once begged for his involvement now offered supporting roles or voice work, careful to avoid physical demands. Behind the scenes, Robert's attempts to maintain relevance revealed desperation disguised as evolution. He launched production companies, invested in sustainable technology, created content for streaming platforms, anything to stay busy without addressing why stillness terrified him. The Team Downey production company with Susan produced projects Robert wouldn't appear in, acknowledging his physical limitations without stating them. He took the Oppenheimer role for prestige and Nolan's protection, knowing the director would film around his constraints. The financial restructuring wasn't about need. $300 million provided permanent security, but about identity. Robert had been working since childhood, earning since addiction, defining himself through productivity. Without Marvel's schedule, without action roles his body couldn't perform. Who was he? He sold properties, including his famous windmill home in the Hamptons, claiming downsizing, but really eliminating locations that required maintenance his body struggled with. The cars he collected sat unused, his numb foot unable to work clutches safely. The slow reckoning came through watching his contemporary actors continue while he couldn't. Tom Cruise still ran at 60. Keanu Reeves still fought at 59, while Robert needed assistance walking on uneven ground. The peripheral neuropathy was progressive, each year slightly worse, the numbness creeping higher, the tremor more visible. Insurance companies now required detailed medical reports, stunt doubles for walking scenes, completion bonds that assumed he might not finish films. Success became a prison, he admitted. I had everything but the ability to enjoy it, because enjoying meant slowing down, and slowing down meant feeling what I'd been running from. By 2024, Robert Downey Jr. was Hollywood's wealthiest retiree in denial, taking any role that would have him while pretending his body wasn't failing, that his identity wasn't tied to work, that he knew who he was without Iron Man's armor or addiction's numbness. By 2024, Robert Downey Jr.'s appearance at the Academy Awards became a carefully managed illusion where he gripped the podium not for emphasis, but for balance. His peripheral neuropathy having progressed to the point where he couldn't trust his legs on stairs without support. What the public didn't know was that Robert had been experiencing cognitive changes his doctors attributed to long-term damage from decades of substance abuse. Word-finding difficulties that made interviews require multiple takes, short-term memory issues that meant constant reminders from Susan, and decision fatigue that made simple choices overwhelming. At 59, the man who defined charismatic intelligence as Tony Stark was struggling to remember his grandchildren's names consistently. The cognitive changes manifested in heartbreaking ways. During a recent podcast appearance, Robert repeated the same recovery story 3 times, unaware of the repetition until the host gently redirected. He'd forgotten he'd already announced his retirement from Marvel multiple times, each announcement feeling new to him. The famous quick wit had slowed to carefully rehearsed responses, the spontaneous charm replaced by scripted interactions Susan helped prepare. "We're watching him disappear in plain sight," a family friend revealed. "The Robert everyone loves is becoming a performance he can barely maintain." Public speculation about his condition had become unavoidable. Videos analyzing his tremor, his gait, his cognitive pauses went viral regularly. Social media dissected every appearance, comparing recent footage to his Marvel days, diagnosing conditions from clips. When he needed visible assistance at a premiere, hashtags about his decline trended for days. The man who'd been addiction's most visible success story was becoming its delayed tragedy, proof that recovery doesn't erase damage, just delays presentation. The isolation had become complete despite constant surveillance. Susan managed every aspect of his life, from medications to social interactions, but Robert experienced it as loving imprisonment. His children visited in shifts, monitoring their father while pretending it was casual. He couldn't drive anymore, couldn't be alone for extended periods, couldn't trust his own judgment about his capabilities. "I'm babysat at 60, Robert told his sponsor. "The man who played Genius Billionaire needs help remembering if he's taken his medications." Recent controversies only deepened his withdrawal. Comments about Marvel movies being factory products after leaving the franchise sparked backlash from fans who felt betrayed. His admission that he couldn't watch his Iron Man films because they reminded him of when his body worked properly was criticized as ungrateful. An incident where he seemed confused about which film he was promoting became a viral meme mocking his condition. "I've become what I always feared," Robert told Indio during a lucid moment. Not the cautionary tale about addiction, but the aftermath no one wants to discuss. The work continued through elaborate support systems. Voice work for animated projects where multiple sessions could be edited together. Carefully controlled appearances where every moment was scripted. The announcement of returning as Dr. Doom in the MCU was financial necessity, meeting dignity preservation. A role where his face would be hidden, his physical limitations concealed by costume. At 59, Robert Downey Jr. had come full circle from addiction to recovery to the slow dissolution that was addiction's final payment. The man who'd worn armor as superhero now needed it to hide reality. Each appearance was carefully managed theater, each interview a negotiation between who he'd been and who remained. Each day a reminder that sometimes survival is its own kind of tragedy. Today, at 60, Robert Downey Jr. continues performing recovery while managing peripheral neuropathy, that stolen sensation from his extremities, cognitive changes that make remembering lines increasingly difficult, and the exhausting maintenance of being everyone's favorite comeback story when the comeback itself is compromising. He rises each morning in his Malibu home, takes medications for conditions caused by choices made before his children were born, and prepares for another day of being Iron Man without armor. His net worth remains substantial at $300 million. His legacy secure as the architect of Marvel's dominance. But he works now through elaborate support systems, each role requiring more assistance than the last. Each appearance carefully managed to maintain the illusion of the Robert everyone needs him to be. The truth in Robert's story: sometimes recovery means surviving your survival, and sometimes the bill for your past comes due just when you thought you'd paid in full. If this moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more stories revealing the true cost of resurrection.